My name is Jeremy Renner, and I'm 73 years old. I want you to know from the very beginning that this is real. Not the kind of real where I'm cleaning up the details to make myself sound better, or where I've softened the sharp edges of pain into something more palatable. This is the kind of real that tastes like pennies in your mouth, that keeps you awake at 3 a.m., that makes you understand, finally, what it means to be utterly alone in a room full of people you raised. 47 years ago, I walked into my daughter Sarah's home for a family dinner like I had 1,000 times before. I left it as a man who would never be the same. But that's not where this story begins. It begins much earlier than that, in the places where I became the kind of man who could be erased so completely that people would forget I'd ever existed at all. Let me start with the seismic crack that shattered everything. 5 years before that dinner, during a conversation I was never meant to hear, my daughter Sarah and my son-in-law Marcus decided that I had become too much. Not too sick, not yet. Not too dependent, though we were heading there. But simply too inconvenient. Too much of an obstacle in the life they were building. And my youngest daughter, Catherine, the one I'd driven home from school every single day of her adolescence, the one I'd sat with through her divorce and her depression and her slow climb back to something like happiness. Catherine looked at me with eyes full of what I finally recognized as resentment, and she said words I can still hear with perfect clarity. "Dad, we love you, but your timing couldn't be worse." Timing, as if I'd chosen to age, as if I'd coordinated my physical decline with their ascension into wealth and social status, as if any of this was a personal inconvenience I'd manufactured specifically to derail their lives. Before we get into the rest of this, I need you to understand something about invisibility. It's not a sudden condition. You don't wake up one morning and find yourself unseen. It creeps in like cold through the cracks of a poorly sealed window. It starts with small things, a comment made without you in the room, an inside joke that requires context you're no longer given, a decision announced rather than discussed. Then it builds. A birthday forgotten by someone who swears they never forget anything. A phone call that gets shorter and shorter as the years accumulate. The gradual realization that your presence is tolerated, but your company is not desired. I was a master carpenter for 53 years. When I say master, I don't mean in the way people throw that word around today. I mean I could look at a piece of wood and see its story, where it grew, how it weathered, what it wanted to become. I could feel the grain under my fingers and know whether it would split or hold. I could frame a house so perfectly square that decades later, contractors would reference my work as the standard. I could build something that would last 100 years, and I did, many times over. I built homes for families. I built the frameworks that protected lives. I built with my hands and my mind in something deeper, a kind of respect for the work that people don't seem to have anymore. My wife, Alina, used to say that I talked to wood like it was a person. She'd catch me standing in front of a piece of walnut or oak, running my hands over it, and she'd laugh and shake her head. "Jeremy," she'd say, "it can't hear you." But it could, in a way. Everything hears the intention behind how you touch it. Everything knows whether you're treating it with respect or just trying to get the job done. Alina understood that about me. She understood that my work wasn't just something I did for money. It was how I loved the world, by building something solid in it. Alina died when I was 62. Cancer. The kind that moves fast, like it's got somewhere else to be, like it can't be bothered to let you get used to the idea. I was sitting next to her in the hospital, holding her hand, feeling it get colder and lighter with each passing day, and I remember thinking that this was the moment when my life would split into before and after. Everything before Alina would be one person, and everything after would be someone else entirely. I was right about that. What I wasn't prepared for was how the after would begin. Because when Alina died, the 3 children I'd raised for 30 and 40 years didn't rally around me. They didn't check on me or make sure I was eating or ask how I was managing the grief that felt like it was liquefying my internal organs. Instead, they did something far more subtle and, in its own way, far more cruel. They began the process of deciding that the death of their mother had somehow made me less necessary. That's not what they would say, of course. If you'd asked them, they would have said they were giving me space. They would have said they assumed I needed time alone. They would have said they were worried but didn't want to intrude. People are very good at telling themselves stories about their own behavior that make them sound compassionate when they're actually just being distant. I have 3 children with a leaner. Margaret is my oldest, 58 years old now. She's a therapist living in Portland. Then there's David, my only son, who's 55 and works in construction management. Sarah is 53 and married to Marcus, who works in finance. And Catherine, my youngest at 50, married now to a good man named Robert, works as a graphic designer. There's also a third daughter, Margaret, who was born when I was just 20. I need to keep this clear in my mind because there was a time, not so long ago, when I could look at their faces and read them like I read wood. Now their faces are like oak that's been painted over so many times you can't see the grain anymore. Margaret lives in Portland. She's a therapist. Before you laugh, I know the irony isn't lost on me that I have a therapist daughter and still ended up here, writing this down because I had nowhere else to put it. But Margaret and we had a different kind of distance. She was always the one who left. Even as a child, Margaret seemed to be looking for the exit. She moved out at 17, moved to a different state at 19, and by the time she was 30, she'd created a life so separate from ours that we saw her at Christmas and maybe 1 week in the summer. I don't fault her for it. Some people are made to build their own lives separate from their families of origin. But it meant that, when the crisis came, Margaret wasn't positioned to witness any of it. David is my son, my middle child, my only son. In another story, this might be the part where I tell you he was the golden one, the boy who could do no wrong, the one who got everything handed to him. But that's not David's story. David was quiet. He was the kind of quiet that made people think he wasn't paying attention, when in fact he was paying more attention than anyone else in the room. He married young, too young, really, to a woman named Patricia. They had 2 kids, and David moved into construction management because he wanted something stable. He wanted something that would let him provide. He wanted something that his father could be proud of, and I was deeply, but I don't think I told him that enough. I don't think I told any of them that enough. Sarah was my oldest daughter, and she was the kind of beautiful that people notice. Dark hair, sharp intelligence, the kind of smile that made people want to do things for her. She married Marcus when she was 26, and they had a relatively good marriage by the standards I was judging by. Marcus was successful in finance. They had 2 children, a daughter and a son, and they lived in a house that was probably worth about 3 times what my own house was worth. Sarah had decided early on that she wanted to be a mother and a philanthropist, and she'd managed both with what looked like ease. She was on the boards of 3 nonprofits. She was involved in her community. She looked successful, which meant she was successful in the way that people around her could see and measure and respect. Catherine, my youngest, was different. Catherine was born when I was 43 after I thought we were done having children. She surprised us. She was beautiful in a quieter way than Sarah, red hair where Sarah had dark freckles, a kind of scattered intelligence that made me laugh. Catherine had a harder time of it. She had a learning disability that wasn't properly diagnosed until she was in high school, and so for years, adults around her thought she wasn't smart. She was exquisitely smart, just not in the way that standardized tests could measure. She felt things deeply. She noticed things others missed. She had a kind of emotional intelligence that made her aware of every shift in mood in a room. This turned out to be a devastating gift in this particular situation. The years between Alina's death when I was 62 and the moment I walked out of Sarah's home when I was 68 were not a continuous story of abandonment. It was subtler than that. It was a series of small moments that only added up to something devastating when you looked back at them all together. It was like water damage to a house. You don't notice it until suddenly the whole structure is compromised. In the first year after Alina died, David came over once a month. He'd bring dinner or take me out, and we'd talk about work and construction and the general state of the world. It was good, those times. It wasn't intimate, but it was something. Then his daughter, my granddaughter Nicole, got into some trouble in high school. Not serious trouble, but enough that it required attention. David had to refocus his energy, and the once-a-month dinners became once every 2 months, and then once every 3 months. I understood. I wasn't resentful. This is what happens when people have their own families to manage. Their attention has to go somewhere, and it can't always go to their elderly parents. Sarah was different. Sarah called on my birthday and on Christmas and on Father's Day, and the calls were cordial and brief. She asked how I was doing and didn't seem to want to hear a detailed answer. She suggested once or twice that I should get involved in activities, that I should volunteer, that I should join a senior center. All of these suggestions came from a place of genuine concern, I think. But they also all had the subtext of, we don't have the bandwidth to have you in our lives right now, and it would be better if you could be busy elsewhere. Catherine was the one who stayed present. Catherine called me twice a week, sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes for an hour or more. She'd ask about my day in a way that suggested she actually wanted to know. She'd tell me about her life, her dating struggles, her work as a graphic designer, her ongoing battles with anxiety. She was the one who understood that grief doesn't have an expiration date, that being alone after 52 years of marriage is a specific and particular kind of terror. Catherine was the one who visited once a month, who sat with me, who let me talk about Alina without trying to tell me it was time to move on. I loved Catherine for that. I loved her with a fierceness that I didn't fully understand at the time. But Catherine was also, it turned out, the canary in the coal mine. She was sensitive to the shifts in my life before anyone else was. She was the one who first noticed my hands shaking, the first time I forgot something important, the first moment when she could see that the machinery of my body was beginning to malfunction. And instead of this making her more present, it made her something else. It made her afraid. Here's something that nobody tells you about aging. It scares people. Not in the way you'd think, not like they're afraid for you, necessarily. They're afraid of what your aging means about their own future. They're afraid of the obligation it might create. They're afraid of the burden of watching someone they love become vulnerable. And in my experience, people are willing to go to remarkable lengths to avoid feeling that fear. 3 years after Alina died, when I was 65, I had a fall. I was cleaning out the gutters on my own house, something I'd done for decades without incident, and my foot slipped. I fell about 10 feet onto my side. I broke 3 ribs in my left arm. I spent 2 nights in the hospital, and the doctors told me I was lucky because at my age, this kind of fall could have been fatal. Lucky. As if luck had anything to do with it. I called Sarah from the hospital. She came and picked me up, and she brought me to her house instead of taking me to my own. She said it was just for a few days, just until I got steadier. Those few days turned into 3 weeks, and during those 3 weeks, I got to see my daughter's home life in a way I hadn't before. Marcus was often away on business trips. When he was home, he was usually in his study on his laptop or his phone, managing money for people who had a lot of it. Sarah was busy with her nonprofits and her children and her house, an enormous structure that required professional management. The kids came and went. Her daughter, Victoria, was in her mid-20s by this point and working at a magazine in Manhattan. Her son, Connor, was in college. The house was full but essentially empty, if that makes sense. Full of activity, but devoid of the kind of presence that makes a home feel warm. I slept in a guest room that looked like it had never been slept in. It was decorated in cool grays and whites, with expensive artwork and fresh flowers that were replaced every 3 days by a service, not by hand. It felt like sleeping in a hotel. I'd lie there in the morning listening to my daughter move through her day, rushing out, coming back, rushing out again, and I'd realize with a kind of creeping horror that she didn't know quite what to do with me. I wasn't company, the way a house guest might be. I was a problem that required management. Catherine came to visit me there. She brought soup and flowers and sat with me for hours. She helped me learn to dress myself one-handed. She helped me shower. She washed my hair because I couldn't lift my arm high enough to do it myself. And while she was helping me, she cried. She cried in a quiet way, as if she didn't want me to know she was doing it, but I could hear her breathing change, could see her eyes get red. "It's okay, sweetheart," I told her. "I'm going to be fine. I'm harder to break than this." "I know, Dad," she said. "I know." When I went back to my own house after those 3 weeks, I wasn't the same man who'd left it. I was more careful. I started asking for help instead of assuming I could do everything myself. I hired someone to clean the gutters and the windows. I had grab bars installed in the bathroom. I modified my life so that I would be less likely to be a burden. This is the thing that people don't understand about invisibility. You help it along. You participate in your own erasure because it's less painful than being the person that everyone else has to manage. 2 years later, when I was 67, I retired. I've been doing smaller jobs for the past few years anyway, less interested in taking on massive projects, more interested in working on specific things that interested me. A cabinet maker I knew wanted to collaborate on a series of custom pieces. A local historical society wanted to hire me to restore some old woodwork. I could have kept working indefinitely. I was still strong, still had all my skills, still loved the work. But I'd been thinking about slowing down. I'd been thinking about having time for other things. What I didn't anticipate was what happens when you stop being productive in the way that the world understands as valuable. I became, in effect, invisible in a whole new way. I stopped being Jeremy, the master carpenter, a man with expertise and value and something to contribute. I became Jeremy, the retired old man, the one with the failing health, the one who had time on his hands, the one who might appreciate an invitation to lunch but probably wouldn't because he'd understand that you were doing it out of obligation. David, who had been checking in somewhat regularly, seemed to run out of things to talk to me about. Without the framework of my work, without the ability to exchange stories about job sites and difficult clients, what did we have in common? That's what his silence seemed to suggest. Without a leaner, without the scaffolding of my professional life, I was just an old man. And old men are boring. Old men are a reminder of death, and death is the one thing no one wants to think about too much. Sarah's calls became quarterly instead of monthly. "How are you doing, Dad? That's good, I'm so glad. Life is just chaos right now, you know. Take care of yourself." Catherine kept calling. Catherine kept visiting. Catherine became the representative of my continued existence in my family's life, and I leaned on that probably too hard. I looked forward to her calls the way a prisoner might look forward to mail. I timed my week around her visits. On the days she was coming, I'd clean up, I'd shave more carefully, I'd make sure I had good coffee and something she liked to eat. And Catherine bore this weight with grace that broke my heart, because I could see the weight. I could see how the weight of being my connection to the world was pressing down on her shoulders more and more. Here's the thing about being someone's lifeline. It's exhausting. And eventually, even people who love you will resent it. Sarah's resentment came first, but not directly at me. It came via Catherine. When Catherine mentioned to me, casually during one of our phone calls, that Sarah had asked her how long she thought she'd be able to keep visiting, I felt something shift. It was like a structural beam suddenly developing a hairline fracture. Not broken yet, but compromised. The architecture of the home was beginning to fail. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I said as long as I could," Catherine said. "Dad, I think Sarah's worried about me." "Worried about what?" There was a pause on the line that lasted too long. "Worried that I've made you my whole life," Catherine said finally. "She thinks I'm using you as an excuse not to move forward with my own things." This struck me like a physical blow. Not because Catherine had made me her whole life, she hadn't, not really, but because Sarah's statement revealed something that I hadn't fully understood until that moment. Sarah wasn't worried about Catherine's emotional well-being. She was worried that Catherine's dedication to me was somehow a reflection on Sarah, or a rebuke. She was worried that Catherine's presence in my life was a comment about Sarah's absence. I spent a lot of time thinking about that conversation. I spent time thinking about what I could do to be less of a burden. Because that's what Sarah's concern really meant. I was a burden. And my youngest daughter, who loved me most consistently, was being burdened by the weight of my existence, and this was somehow my fault. I made a decision then that I didn't articulate to anyone. I made a decision to start pulling back. I started suggesting to Catherine that she should go out, that she shouldn't spend her Saturday visiting me, that she should be dadding, traveling, living a full life. I said it all with good intentions, the way you do. But what I was really doing was beginning to accept the narrative that had been quietly growing in the backgrounds of my children's minds, that I was too much, that I was in the way, that the world would be better if I was less present in it. This acceptance, this quiet consent to my own erasure, turned out to be the foundation upon which everything else would be built. At some point during this period, Marcus began paying more attention to me, not in a warm way, in a way that felt like surveillance. He'd come home when Catherine was visiting, and he'd hover nearby, making conversation with a kind of false cheerfulness that made my skin itch. He'd ask me about my day, ask me about my health, ask me about my finances with a casual offhandedness that made it clear what he was really trying to assess. I didn't realize at the time that Marcus was looking at me and seeing a problem that needed solving. I didn't realize that he was calculating timelines and scenarios, running different possibilities through his financial mind the way I used to run my hands through different types of wood, assessing what needed to happen to create the outcome he wanted. I should have. I was already falling into a pattern where I didn't trust my own instincts anymore. Catherine must have noticed the shift in me because her visits got shorter and less frequent. She didn't do it all at once. It was gradual. A visit that lasted 3 hours instead of 4. A call that got cut short because she had somewhere to be. When I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd say yes, of course, everything's fine, but her voice would have a quality that suggested everything was not fine. And whatever it was something she was managing alone. I was so focused on trying to be less of a burden that I failed to notice that the burden was no longer my aging or my health or my grief about Elena. The burden had become something else entirely. It had become the emotional labor of being the person in the room with no power, the one everyone was negotiating around, the one whose presence required a kind of emotional gymnastics that was wearing everyone out. This is what I've come to understand, looking back. A person in a family can become toxic not through anything they do, but simply through the fact that their existence requires everyone else to be aware of their mortality. As long as you're productive and strong and useful, people can ignore the way your presence reminds them that this body, this mind, this self, it doesn't last forever. But once you're past that threshold, once you're clearly moving toward the end, you become a mirror no one wants to look into. I was that mirror. When I was 68, Sarah called me on a Tuesday afternoon. She said she and Marcus wanted to talk to me about something important, and would I like to come over for dinner on Saturday. She said it in a way that suggested this was a special occasion, something that required preparation. I said yes, of course, and then I spent the next 4 days in a state of low-level anxiety, the way you do when you know something is coming and you don't know what it is. I should have trusted that instinct. I drove to Sarah's house that Saturday in late October. The leaves were turning gold and red, the kind of fall that makes you feel like the world is beautiful and temporary all at once. Sarah's house was in a wealthy suburb, the kind of place where the houses are large and the yards are maintained by professionals, and everything looks like it belongs in a magazine layout about successful living. I'd driven to that house probably 100 times, but that day it felt like driving towards something I didn't want to face. Marcus answered the door. He was wearing a sweater that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, and he had the kind of smile on his face that made my stomach tighten. It was the smile of a man who'd already won something and was now just playing out the necessary motions. "Jeremy," he said, "so glad you could make it. Come in, come in. Sarah's in the kitchen." The house was warm and smelled like the food Sarah had ordered from somewhere, probably lamb and rosemary and garlic. The dining room table was set with real plates and real napkins, the kind of presentation that meant this was a significant conversation, not just a casual family dinner. Sarah came out of the kitchen, and she looked beautiful in that pulled-together way that suggested she'd recently been to the salon, recently had her hair and makeup done. She hugged me, and her hug felt stiff, like she was performing the gesture for an audience. "Dad," she said, "come sit. We have so much to tell you." We sat. There was wine poured without anyone asking if I wanted wine. There was the kind of small talk that happens before something larger. "How is work?" I was retired. "How is the house?" I was managing. "How are you feeling?" I was fine, which we both knew meant whatever I said, the answer was going to be wrong in some essential way. Then, as we were eating the lamb, Sarah set down her fork and took a deep breath. Marcus reached over and put his hand on her arm, a gesture that struck me as performative, as if what was about to happen required emotional support, or as if the sight of him supporting her would make what she was about to say feel more justified. "Dad," Sarah said, "we wanted to talk to you about your future." The way she said it, your future, with that particular emphasis, made it clear that what she meant was your inevitable decline and what we're going to do about it when your body and mind finally give out completely. "Okay," I said, setting down my own fork. "What about my future?" "We're concerned," Marcus said, taking the opening even though no one had passed him the conversational ball. "We're concerned about you living alone. You've had a fall. You're 70 now." I was 68, but I didn't correct him. "And we think it's time to start thinking about what happens next, what your living situation is going to look like." I looked at Sarah. "Is this something you've been thinking about?" "For a while, actually," she said. "We care about you very much, and we want to make sure you're safe and supported." "I'm safe," I said. "I'm managing fine." "You're isolated," Marcus said. "No one wants you to be isolated. There are some wonderful communities for people in your situation. Active adult communities, places where there's a social element, where there's medical staff on site, where you wouldn't have to think about maintenance and cleaning." "You mean nursing homes?" I said. "Not nursing homes," Sarah said quickly. "Senior living communities. They're very different. They're more like resort communities. Your friends live there. They have programs and activities. It's actually an exciting way to live at this stage of life." I set my napkin on the table very carefully. "Are you asking me to move into a senior living community, or are you telling me that I'm going to?" There was a silence. In that silence, I could hear the air conditioning running, could hear the sound of traffic from the street outside, could hear the particular quality of silence that happens when someone is trying to figure out how to get their way, without seeming unreasonable. "We're asking," Sarah said finally. "We love you and we want what's best for you." "What's best for me is to keep my own house," I said. "My own space, my independence." "For now," Marcus said. "But these things change quickly. We'd rather get ahead of it. We'd rather you be in a supportive environment before you really need it." "We've already looked at some places," Sarah said, and this admission felt like a betrayal in a way I didn't yet fully understand. "There's one about 20 minutes from us that's really lovely. We could look at it together if you'd like." "No," I said. "Dad." "No," I said again. "I'm not ready. I'm not interested. I'm managing fine on my own, and I'm going to keep managing on my own for as long as I can." What followed was the kind of conversation that happens when two people have already decided something and are simply trying to convince the other person that they've decided it too. There was reasoning. There was concern phrased as care. There was the implication that I was being stubborn, that I was refusing help, that I was being difficult in the way that old people are sometimes difficult, unreasonable, proud, unable to see what was in their own best interest. "It's not about you," Marcus said at one point, and this statement was so absurd that I almost laughed. "It's about your safety and your quality of life." "It's absolutely about me," I said. "It's about whether I get to have agency over my own life, or whether that decision has already been made for me." The dinner continued. The food was good. The conversation moved on to other things: Sarah's nonprofits, Marcus's work, the general state of the world. But something had shifted. I could feel it the way you can feel a crack in the foundation of a house, the moment before it becomes structural damage. As I was leaving, Catherine came out of her room upstairs. I hadn't known she was in the house. She looked at me with eyes that were already wet, and she hugged me like she was saying goodbye to someone she wasn't sure she'd see again. "I love you, Dad," she said. "I love you too, sweetheart," I said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, but she wasn't fine. She was crying in that silent way that suggested she'd been crying for a while. That was the dinner. That was the moment where the shape of the future started to become clear, even though I didn't fully understand it yet. I didn't tell David about the dinner. I didn't tell Catherine. I told myself that it was just a conversation, that Sarah and Marcus were doing what they thought was right, that they would let it go when they realized I was serious about wanting to stay in my own house. I told myself the story that I'd been telling myself more and more frequently over the past few years, that my children loved me, that they wanted what was best for me, that their distance was about their own lives, not about me. But something had cracked. Over the following weeks, I started to notice things more acutely. When Sarah called, less frequently now, maybe once every 6 weeks, she asked me specific questions about my health, my medications, my finances. She'd send me articles about senior living, leaving them in my email with a subject line like, "Thought you might find this interesting." She'd mention, casually, that Catherine had said I seemed tired, or that Catherine was worried I wasn't eating well, when Catherine had never said any such thing to me. I realized, with a kind of slow horror, that my family was building a case. They were documenting a narrative in which I was declining, becoming unable to care for myself, becoming a burden that needed to be managed. And they were using the person who loved me most as a source of information, which was brilliant in its cruelty because Catherine couldn't refuse to answer without being seen as unloving. I called Catherine and told her to stop reporting on me. "Your sister is using what you tell me about how I'm doing to build a case for putting me in a home," I said. "I need you to stop giving her ammunition." "Dad, she's just worried," Catherine said. "I don't care if she's worried," I said, and I heard the anger in my own voice, and I was ashamed of directing it at Catherine, but not so ashamed that I could stop. "I care that she's using you to undermine my autonomy, and I care that you're letting her do it." Catherine cried then. "I'm not letting her do anything," she said. "I'm just answering questions. I'm doing my best." I softened then because Catherine didn't deserve my anger. Catherine was the victim in this situation as much as I was, caught between a father she loved and a sister who was asking her to participate in his erasure. "I know you are," I said. "I'm sorry. I know you're doing your best." But the damage was done. Catherine became less present after that conversation, as if my anger had given her permission to step back, to admit that she couldn't do this anymore, that the weight of being my lifeline was too much. The visits stopped. The calls became less frequent. By the time my birthday came and went in January, with a phone call and a check, neither of which felt particularly celebratory, I understood that I had lost the one person in my family who had been a real advocate for my continued presence in their lives. I was truly alone now, in a way that I hadn't been before. Alone and watched carefully with documentation, with a kind of clinical attention that felt like hate. This is the part of the story where I'm supposed to tell you how I pulled myself together, how I started taking better care of myself, how I got involved in activities, how I built a life that didn't depend on my family's attention or approval, How I became the kind of person who couldn't be erased. The truth is messier than that. The truth is that for a while, I let the narrative they were building become my own narrative. I started to believe that I was a burden. I started to believe that the world would be better off if I took up less space. I started, in small ways, to give up. I didn't go to the doctor when I should have. I didn't eat regularly. I didn't sleep well. I sat in my house, which suddenly felt very empty, and I thought about Alina and wondered if she'd feel disappointed in how things had turned out. I thought about the homes I'd built, the families I'd helped house, and I wondered if any of them were thinking about me, or if I was just a person who had shown up and done a job and then moved on. There's a particular quality to depression in older men. It's quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just slowly turns down the volume on your life until you're existing in a kind of muted version of reality. You get up because your body has the habit of it. You shower because you know you should. You exist, but you're not really living. You're waiting. For what you're not entirely sure. For the end, maybe. For the moment when someone finally comes to move you into a place where you don't have to pretend to be managing anymore. I was in this state for about 8 months. 8 months of declining health, 8 months of watching my own deterioration with a kind of detached curiosity, 8 months of knowing that my family was right, that I was becoming too much, that maybe a senior living community actually would be the best thing. Then, in late August of the year I would turn 69, I got a call from David. "Hey, Dad," he said, and his voice was different than it had been in a while. "I need your help." Those words did something to me. They did something to the part of me that had started to accept my own uselessness. They did something to the part of me that had been quietly fatting away. "Of course," I said. "What do you need?" "I'm working on a restoration job," David said. "Historical house, early 1800s. The owner wants period-appropriate finishes on the woodwork, and I remembered that you used to talk about doing that kind of thing. I was wondering if you might want to consult on it, just to look at it, advise on materials and techniques. You don't have to do the work if you don't want to, but I could use your expertise." "I'd like that," I said. "Yeah, that's great. I'll text you the address. Can you come by this Saturday morning? I'll buy you breakfast." "Okay," I said, "Saturday morning." After I hung up the phone, I sat for a long time in my kitchen. I sat, and I realized that I had been waiting for someone to need me. Not out of obligation or guilt, but because they genuinely had something they thought I could help with. It wasn't much. It was a small thing, but it was something. I started eating better. I started sleeping better. I called the doctor and got my medications adjusted. I started moving more. Doing small carpentry projects around my own house. Engaging with the world in a way that felt purposeful. When I met David at that house on Saturday morning, I felt something shift inside me. He was there with a young man who was his apprentice, learning the trade, and David looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in a long time. He looked at me like I was valuable. "Dad," he said, "this is Marcus, my apprentice. Marcus, this is my father. He built some of the most beautiful custom woodwork in 3 states." The apprentice, different Marcus than Sarah's Marcus, looked impressed. "Seriously," he said. "Seriously," David said. "He's going to help me figure out what we're looking at here." We spent 4 hours in that house. We examined the original woodwork, we took samples, we talked about techniques and materials and the philosophy of restoration. My hands, which had been shaking with the particular tremor that comes from disuse, steadied as soon as I started working. My mind, which had been foggy, became clear. I was myself again. Not all the way, not completely. I don't think you can come back all the way from that kind of erasure, but I was present. I was useful. I mattered. David hired me as a consultant on the project. It was part-time work, just a few hours a week, but it was real work. I was compensated fairly. I was given credit. When the project was finished 3 months later and the owner came to see the work, they specifically thanked me for my advice. They asked if I could recommend them to other people who might need restoration work. "Yes," I said, "I can." And I did. Over the next several months, I got other calls, other jobs. Nothing massive, nothing that required me to work 40-hour weeks anymore, but enough to give me a sense of purpose. Enough to make me believe that I had something to offer the world. It was during this period, in early spring, when I was 69 and feeling more alive than I'd felt in years, that I made a decision. I decided that I was not going to move into a senior living community. I decided that I was not going to accept the narrative my family was building about my usefulness or my burdenness. I decided that I was going to be difficult and stubborn and unreasonable, if that's what it took to stay in my own house, in my own life, on my own terms. I called Sarah and told her this, not unkindly but clearly. "I'm not moving," I said. "I've thought about it carefully and I'm not interested. I'm continuing to work. I'm managing my health. I'm doing fine on my own. I need you to accept that." There was a silence on the line. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay, Dad, if that's what you want." "It is," I said. "It is what I want." What I didn't know was that Sarah had already decided what would happen next. What I didn't know was that my refusal had been factored into her planning, and that she had a contingency for this exact situation. What I didn't know was that my family had already decided, collectively and without my input, that whether I liked it or not, my days of living independently were numbered. I had maybe 6 months of peace, 6 months of work and purpose and the sensation of being needed. During those 6 months, Catherine called me again. Not as frequently as she used to, but with a kind of warmth that suggested that maybe I hadn't lost her completely. David and I had a real relationship again, not based on obligation but on mutual respect and genuine affection. I even had lunch with Margaret once when she came into town, and while our relationship remained somewhat distant, it felt less like an absence and more like a difference in the way we approached family. Even my relationship with Sarah improved, or seemed to. She invited me to dinner a few times. She called more regularly. Marcus was, if not warm, at least not hostile. I started to believe that maybe we could find a way to have a relationship that wasn't predicated on me accepting that I was a burden. I started to believe that maybe the crisis had passed, that maybe we could move forward into a different kind of family dynamic. I should have known better. I should have understood that the peace was just the eye of the storm. It was a Saturday evening in late September, almost a year after that first dinner where Sarah and Marcus had suggested I move, when Catherine called me. "Hi, Dad," she said, and her voice had a particular quality that made my stomach clench. "Are you doing anything tomorrow? Sarah's having a family dinner. She'd really like you to come." "Sure," I said carefully. "What time?" "1 o'clock, just lunch, nothing fancy." But it was fancy. I could hear in her voice that whatever was about to happen, it was not nothing. I showed up at 1 o'clock the next day. It was a Sunday in late September, early fall, the kind of day that reminded you that the year was dying. I brought a bottle of wine and a dessert from a bakery. I parked in their circular driveway, looking at the house that I'd seen dozens of times but which still always felt like the home of someone else, someone more successful, someone more put together than I was. David was there, which was unusual. He typically didn't come to Sarah's family gatherings unless there was a specific reason. Margaret was there too, somehow, though her presence felt like a surprise even to her. Catherine looked like she'd been crying and had carefully redone her makeup to hide it. Sarah greeted me at the door. She was wearing something that could only be described as armor, a dress that was expensive and structured and made her look more like the CEO of something than like my daughter. Marcus stood behind her, and that smile was back on his face. The same smile from a year ago. "Dad," Sarah said, "I'm so glad you're here. Come sit down. We're so happy everyone could make it." The dining room was set with good food, catered definitely because I knew Sarah's cooking and this wasn't it. There was wine and bread and something with fish, something with vegetables. We sat down and we made small talk. How is work for me? Still consulting, still busy enough. How is work for David? Good, business is good. How is the article Margaret was writing something for a psychology journal? How is life for Catherine, which seemed to be code for barely surviving? Then, after the main course, Sarah stood up. She stood up from the table, and everyone else quieted down, as if this had been choreographed. I want to thank everyone for being here, Sarah said, because what we're about to discuss is something that affects all of us. It's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I've talked with Marcus extensively about it, and we've decided that it's time to have an open conversation. I knew. In that moment, I knew what was about to happen. I could feel it the way you feel a shift in weather, the moment before a storm hits. Dad, Sarah said, and her voice had the particular tone of someone delivering a difficult diagnosis. We're all worried about you. We love you, but we're concerned about your safety and your well-being. We think that it's time for you to consider a more supported living environment. There it was. The same suggestion, dressed up in different language, prepared with more family present, delivered with what felt like a sentence. Sarah, I said, and I was proud that my voice remained steady, we've already had this conversation. I told you I'm not interested. I know, she said, but we think you need to hear it again from all of us. All of you, I looked around the table. David was looking at his food. Margaret was looking at Sarah like she was watching an experiment. Catherine looked like she wanted to disappear. We've been talking, Sarah continued, and we all agree that this is what's best. David's even agreed that we should start visiting some facilities together. We've found a few that are really special. Places where you'd have community, where there would be medical professionals on site. I don't want to visit any facilities, I said. I want to go home, my home, the one I've lived in for 30 years. Dad, be reasonable, Marcus said, and his presence in this conversation, his voice, his involvement made something break inside me. He wasn't even my son. He was married to my daughter, and he was sitting at my daughter's table, ostensibly telling me what I should do with my life. How about you don't tell me to be reasonable, I said, and I could hear the anger now clear and cold. This is not your family. This is not your decision. Marcus is part of this family, Sarah said sharply, and he's part of this conversation. He's your husband, I said. He's not my family. My family is sitting at this table, and apparently they've decided something about my future without asking me. We're asking you now, Margaret said, her therapist voice engaged. We're asking you to consider what we're saying, to take it seriously. I have taken it seriously, I said. I considered it a year ago when Sarah first suggested it. I considered it carefully, and I decided it wasn't something I wanted to do. I'm managing my own life. I'm still working. I'm still independent, and unless you're going to have me legally declared incompetent, that decision stands. For now, Marcus said, but things change. Things could change very quickly. I looked at him. I looked at this man who had barely acknowledged my existence for decades, who had been present in my daughter's life but rarely in mine, and I felt something settle into clarity. He was the architect of this. Not Sarah. Sarah was just executing the plan. It was Marcus who had been waiting, watching, calculating. It was Marcus who had decided that my presence in Sarah's life was a complication he could solve. What's your interest in this? I asked him. What do you care whether I live at home or in a facility? Marcus had the good sense to look slightly uncomfortable. I care about your daughter, he said. I care about what she wants and what she needs. And what she needs is for me to go away, I said. That's not what she needs, Marcus said. She needs to not have to worry about you all the time. I haven't asked her to worry about me, I said. You don't have to ask, Sarah said. I worry anyway. I can't help it. Every time my phone rings, I worry that something's happened to you. Every time Catherine misses one of our planned calls, I worry that it's because something's wrong. I worry that you're going to have another fall, another emergency, and we won't be there. Then stop worrying, I said. I'm 70, I'm not special, people die. People have falls, that's life, that's not your responsibility. "You're my father," Sarah said, and her voice cracked. "Of course you're my responsibility." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw in that moment that she was telling herself a story too. She was telling herself that her concern about my welfare was love, when actually what it was the desire to control a situation that felt uncontrollable. She was telling herself that her suggestions about moving were for my benefit, when actually what they were was a way of managing her own anxiety about aging and death, and the fact that parents are temporary, that children eventually have to live without them. But understanding that didn't change anything. Understanding that didn't make what was happening any less real. "I have to go," I said. I stood up from the table. "Dad, wait," Catherine said, and she reached for my arm. "I can't do this," I said. "I can't sit here and listen to you all telling me what's best for me, when what you really mean is what's best for you. I'm going home." "Dad," David started, and there was something in his voice that suggested he wanted to say something more, but he didn't know how to say it. Or maybe he did know, and he decided it wasn't worth the risk. I walked to the door. Sarah followed me. "I'm not trying to hurt you," she said. "I know," I said, and it was true. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was just trying to make her life simpler, and if that meant removing the complication of my existence, then so be it. That wasn't cruelty. That was just the natural self-protection of people who have other things they want to do, other lives they want to build. "I love you, Dad," she said. "I know you do," I said, "but not enough." I drove home. I drove through the late afternoon, through the slow turning of the leaves, through a landscape that suddenly felt like enemy territory. I drove to the house that I'd owned for 30 years, that I'd built and maintained and loved, and I walked through the door like I was walking into a tomb. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a bottle of whiskey, and I made a decision. I was not going to fight this anymore. I was not going to insist on my independence or my autonomy or my right to live on my own terms. I was going to do something much more radical. I was going to disappear. Not the way my family had been slowly disappearing me, through distance and silence and the erasure of attention. I was going to actually disappear. I was going to find a way to remove myself from the equation entirely, so that no one would have to worry about me anymore, so that no one would have to manage the complication of my aging, so that everyone could move forward with their lives unencumbered. I made plans. I thought about where I'd go, how I'd do it when I'd do it. I thought about whether I'd leave a note, whether I'd give them the mercy of knowing where I'd gone, or whether I'd just vanish like I'd slowly been vanishing anyway. I made plans and I was at peace, because for the first time in a long time, I'd taken control of something. For the first time in a long time, I'd made a decision that was entirely my own, regardless of what anyone else wanted or thought. I got as far as planning the details. I researched how much money I'd need, where I could go. I looked at maps of places far away, places where I didn't know anyone, places where I could be truly anonymous. Then, in the middle of the night, 3 days after that dinner, the phone rang. It was the hospital. It was David's daughter, Nicole, my granddaughter, calling from a hospital emergency room. She was there with her father, and there had been an accident at a job site. A beam had fallen. Dad, my son David, was in critical condition. They were asking if there was anyone else in the family they should call, if there was anyone who should know. I don't remember driving to the hospital. I remember the moment I saw David lying in the hospital bed, though. I remember the sight of his left leg wrapped in a cast, the way his face was swollen from the impact, the machines beeping around him, the monitors tracking the continued evidence of his survival. "Dad," he said when he saw me, "I'm sorry." "Don't you dare apologize," I said. I moved his hand carefully, avoiding the IV, and I held it. "What happened?" Nicole told me. A beam had shifted. David had been standing under it. He'd been partially crushed. The doctors were saying he'd been lucky. Nothing had been severed. Nothing vital had been hit. but he was going to be in the hospital for at least a week, and then he'd need surgery and physical therapy and months of recovery. "I can't work," he said. "I have a job lined up for next month. I can't work." "You can worry about that later," I said. I sat with him through the night. I sat with him while his ex-wife Patricia came and went, while Nicole came and went, while the hospital staff came and went. I sat with him, and I thought about the fact that 3 days ago I'd been planning to disappear, and now I was needed in a way I hadn't been needed in years. The next morning, David said, "I need someone to help me. With the house, with recovery, with getting back to work eventually. I need someone who understands the work, who can help manage things while I'm recuperating." He was looking at me with something like hope in his eyes. "I'll be there," I said. And just like that, without any grand revelation or emotional speech, I was no longer trying to die. I was trying to live for someone who needed me. Not because I'd suddenly discovered the meaning of life or overcome my depression or found some deep well of self-worth, but because being needed, actually needed, was a more powerful drug than anything else I could access. I spent the next 6 weeks at David's house. I cooked for him. I helped with his physical therapy. I managed his medication schedule. I fielded calls from clients and contractors and people who needed to know about his status. I was useful. I was valuable. I was the one holding the household together while the household member who typically did that was recovering. During those 6 weeks, no one from Sarah's house called. No one checked on David. There were no concerned visits from my other daughter, no words of support from my son-in-law. Just silence. The same silence that had been slowly growing for years. But I was too busy to notice. I was too needed. By the time David was ready to start moving around on crutches, ready to transition to physical therapy on his own, I'd found my footing again. I'd remembered who I was when I was useful. I'd remembered that I had value, not because my children said so, but because there was someone who needed what I could offer. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Dad," David said, as I was getting ready to leave his house to go back to my own. "I really don't." "You would have managed," I said, "but I'm glad I was here." "Will you keep consulting?" he asked. "That restoration job we did, it was good. I've got more work lined up. I could use your expertise." "Yes," I said, "I'll keep consulting." When I drove home that night, I felt different than I'd felt the day of that dinner at Sarah's. I felt like someone who had a future that extended beyond the next few days. I felt like someone who had a reason to keep going. And I told myself a new story. I told myself that if Sarah didn't want me in her life, that was okay. I told myself that if Catherine couldn't handle the weight of being my connection to the world, that was her choice. I told myself that if Margaret and I were going to remain somewhat distant, that was fine. I told myself that what mattered was that David needed me, and I could provide what he needed, and that was enough. It wasn't enough, but I was good at lying to myself. I'd had years of practice. The next 18 months were good. They weren't perfect, but they were good. David's recovery was slow, but he was determined. He went to physical therapy 3 times a week. He started working with me on smaller projects, nothing that required him to be on his feet for extended periods, but enough that he felt like he was building toward a full return to work. His daughter Nicole came around more. She seemed to appreciate that I was there, that her father had support, that the family wasn't completely fractured. I saw Catherine occasionally. She'd call, and sometimes I'd invite her over and we'd talk about her life, about her struggles with relationships and work, about the ways that growing up in our family had shaped her. These conversations were never easy. There was always a kind of tension underneath them, the weight of unspoken things. But they were something. They were a connection. Margaret I saw once a year around Christmas, and we maintained the kind of cordial distance that I think actually suited us both. She was busy with her practice, with her life in Portland. I was busy with David, with consulting, with the slow business of staying engaged in the world. We weren't close, but we were family in the way that some people are family, connected by blood and history, but not by daily experience. Sarah I did not see. We did not speak. It was like a mutual agreement that didn't need to be stated. After that dinner, where her family had collectively tried to remove me from my own life, I had decided that I was not interested in a relationship that was predicated on my acceptance of my own burdenness. And Sarah, it seemed, had decided that she was not interested in fighting for a relationship where her father had set such a boundary. So we simply didn't have one. The door closed, and neither of us knocked on it. I wondered sometimes if she thought about me. I wondered if she told people that she had a father who was old and difficult and refused help. I wondered if she felt guilty, or if she'd managed to rationalize it all in a way that let her off the hook. But mostly, I tried not to wonder. I tried to focus on the life that I had, the work that I did, the people who had room for me in their lives. I turned 71. David took me to dinner. Catherine called and gave me her gift, a beautiful leather journal, as if she knew that I was the kind of person who would eventually need to write this down. Margaret sent a card. Sarah did not acknowledge the day, and I did not expect her to. During this period, I also started to notice that I was aging differently than I'd feared. Maybe it was the sense of purpose. Maybe it was knowing that I still had something to offer. Maybe it was just the grace of genetics. But my hands remained steady. My mind remained clear. I had energy. I had the kind of health that comes from having something to get up for. I started taking on more consulting work. My name had gotten around. People who'd worked with David on restoration projects called and asked if I'd advise on theirs. I became something of a specialist in period woodwork, in the kind of restoration that required knowledge of techniques and materials that had largely fallen out of common use. I made decent money. I stayed busy. I built something of a life that was independent of my family, that didn't rely on their acknowledgement or approval. It was, in many ways, the life I should have built years ago. The life I would have built if I hadn't spent so much time waiting for my family to see me, to value me, to make room for me in their lives. I was seeing myself now. I was valuing myself. I was making my own room. But here's the thing about building a life independent of people you love. You never actually stop wanting them to see it. You never actually stop hoping that maybe, eventually, they'll realize they were wrong about you. That maybe they'll come back and say, "I'm sorry, we were wrong. We shouldn't have tried to erase you. We should have understood that you had value beyond what we could measure." I was foolish enough to believe, even after everything, that maybe Sarah would eventually have that realization. That maybe, with time, she'd come to understand that what she and Marcus had done wasn't about care. It was about control. That maybe she'd recognize the damage she'd done, not just to me, but to Catherine, who'd become collateral damage in this whole operation. That maybe she'd want to make it right. But people don't always come to realizations about their own behavior. People are very good at protecting their own narrative, even in the face of evidence that the narrative is false. I found out much later that during this period Sarah had told people I had dementia. Not explicitly, she was too smart for that, but she dropped hints in conversations. "Dad's having some memory issues. We're concerned about his cognitive health. We're looking into some options for when things get worse." She was still building the case, still preparing the groundwork, in case she ever needed to actually have me declared incompetent. I didn't know this at the time. It's one of those things you find out later, when the damage is already so deep that finding out just confirms something you'd already sensed. What I did know, what became increasingly clear as months turned into the better part of a year, was that Sarah was moving on. Sarah was building the narrative that she no longer had an elderly, dependent father. Sarah was writing the story in which I either no longer existed, or had become someone else's problem, or had managed somehow to fix myself into a state that no longer required her attention. Maybe she believed it. Maybe she'd convinced herself that I really was okay, that I didn't need anything from her, that the fact that I was no longer in her life meant that I was thriving. Maybe the lack of contact felt like proof of my independence, rather than proof of her abandonment. I don't know. I've had a lot of time to think about this, and I still don't know. What I do know is that around the 18-month mark after that dinner, I got a call from Catherine. "Dad," she said, and her voice was different than it had been in a while. It was the voice of someone who was about to do something hard. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong exactly," she said. "But I need to talk to you about something. Can I come over tonight?" "Of course," I said. "Is everything okay?" "I'm getting married," she said. "I met someone, I'm in love, and he asked me to marry him and I said yes." For a moment I couldn't speak. Catherine, who had spent so much of her life struggling with relationships, who had been hurt multiple times, who had slowly rebuilt her self-worth through therapy and hard work, Catherine was getting married. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it. "Who is he? Tell me everything." His name was Robert. He was a teacher. He was kind and funny, and he made Catherine laugh in the way that suggested she'd forgotten she could laugh like that. They'd met at a coffee shop. She'd spilled her drink on his laptop. They'd laughed. He'd bought her a new drink while his laptop dried, and something had shifted between them. That was 3 months ago. He proposed 2 weeks ago with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "I want you to walk me down the aisle," Catherine said. "I need you to walk me down the aisle." "Of course I will," I said. "I would be honored." "There's something else," Catherine said, and her voice became quieter. "I haven't told Sarah yet. I wanted to tell you first, but I need to ask you something. I need to ask if you think I should invite her to the wedding." The weight of that question, the implications of it, settled heavily between us. "Do you want her there?" I asked. "I don't know," Catherine said. "I love her. She's my sister, but she hurt me. When I was your connection, I was drowning, and she made it clear that she thought I was drowning because of you, not because of the weight she was putting on me. She never asked how I was. She just asked about you. And when I finally pulled back, when I finally said I couldn't be the bridge anymore, she didn't check on me. She didn't see that I was struggling. She just saw that she'd lost her access to information." "Then maybe you don't invite her," I said carefully. "Maybe your wedding is about the people who love you enough to show up for you unconditionally." "But she's still my sister," Catherine said, "and I don't want to punish her." "You wouldn't be punishing her," I said. "You'd be protecting yourself. There's a difference." In the end, Catherine did invite Sarah. Because Catherine is the kind of person who wants to believe the best of people, who wants to believe that there's always a way to make things right, who hasn't yet learned that some people don't want to be made right with. They just want to be absolved of responsibility without doing any of the work. Sarah came to the wedding. She wore something elegant and expensive and looked beautiful in the way that suggested she'd spent a lot of time and money making sure she looked beautiful. She said the right things to Catherine. She cried during the ceremony. She gave a toast at the reception about how proud she was of her sister, about how she'd always known Catherine would find someone wonderful. And Catherine, being Catherine, wanted to believe that this meant something, that the walls had come down, that her sister was truly happy for her. But I could see it, even from a distance. I could see that Sarah was performing. I could see that the performance was for the audience, for the people at the wedding, for the people she'd told that her sister was getting married. I could see that it had nothing to do with Catherine, and everything to do with Sarah's image of herself as a good sister, a loving family member, someone who could rise above whatever conflict had existed. During the reception, when I was standing near the bar, I heard Sarah talking to one of her friends. "It's been such a difficult time," she was saying, "with my father being the way he is. But Catherine's found someone wonderful, and I'm just grateful that I can be here to support her through this." "What's the matter with your father?" her friend asked. "Well, he's getting on," Sarah said. "Aging, you know, making difficult decisions about his future, but we're handling it as a family." We weren't handling it as a family. We weren't handling it at all. And there was no we. There was just Sarah and Marcus, continuing to build the narrative that somehow, magically, I would disappear and my problem would solve itself. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't say anything. I just watched Catherine's wedding, which was beautiful and joyful and full of real love, and I thought about how quickly a family can fracture and how carefully everyone involved can pretend that the fracturing isn't happening. After Catherine's wedding, life continued in the way that life continues. It changed shapes, took on new configurations, but the basic truth remained the same. I had been erased from my oldest daughter's life, and that erasure was permanent. It was like an amputation. You learn to live without the part, but you never stop being aware that something is missing. David's recovery continued. By the time he was 2 years post-accident, he was back to work full-time, though he was cautious about taking on the kind of physical jobs that had made him vulnerable to injury in the first place. He hired someone else to do the heavy lifting, the jobs that required being on scaffolding or in tight spaces. He moved into more of a management and consulting role, which meant that my work with him became even more essential. I was the expert he could call on when something required specialized knowledge. We developed a rhythm, the two of us. He would call me with a question, a homeowner asking about period-appropriate finishes, a contractor wanting advice on restoration techniques, a historical society hopping to consult on a major preservation project. I would come over or he would come to me, and we would solve the problem together. There was a companionship in it that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with mutual respect and genuine affection. "You should be taking the lead on these jobs," David said once, as we were wrapping up a consultation on a 1920s house that was being painstakingly restored. "You're the expert. You should be getting the credit." "I don't need the credit," I said. "I'm 72. I'm past the point of caring about credit. I just like the work." "That's bullshit," David said, but he said it without heat. "You deserve more than being the advisor on the side. You deserve to have your name on the work, to be recognized for what you do." "If I wanted recognition," I said, "I should have done things differently 30 years ago. I should have been more ambitious. But I'm not ambitious anymore. I just like solving problems with someone I respect." David looked at me for a long moment. "I respect you too," he said finally. "I hope you know that. I hope you know that I see what you do and I respect it." It was a small thing, that statement, but it meant everything. It meant that I had one child who was looking at me and seeing me, really seeing me, not the narrative that had been built about me, but who I actually was. It meant that I wasn't completely invisible, that the erasure wasn't total. Catherine checked in regularly. She was happy with Robert. They were talking about moving to a larger apartment, maybe eventually a house. Catherine was happy in a way that she hadn't been happy before, and some of that happiness extended itself toward me. She'd call and tell me about her day, about her work, about her new life. And I'd listen, and I'd tell her about mine, and we'd have conversations that felt real and unforced. Margaret I saw once at Christmas, and once in the summer, and we maintained our cordial, distant dance. I don't think Margaret took sides. I think Margaret was troubled by what had happened, in the way that therapists are troubled by family dysfunction that they're too close to fix. But she maintained a kind of neutrality that I appreciated, if not entirely understood. And Sarah remained absent, not in the sense that she was dead or unreachable. She was very much alive, very much out in the world, building her life, moving forward. But absent from my life, from my daily experience, from my knowledge of what she was doing or thinking or feeling. I stopped hoping she would change her mind. I stopped waiting for her to realize what she'd done, to apologize, to try to rebuild what had been broken. I accepted that this was how it was going to be, and I found a way to be okay with that. Not happy about it. I don't think you can be happy about losing a child, even if that loss is more about emotional distance than physical death, but at peace with it, which is different. I accepted that Sarah had made her choices, and I had made mine, and the distance between us was the result of both of those things. I was 73 years old, consulting regularly, spending time with the children who wanted to spend time with me, building a life that had meaning and purpose. I was fine. I was managing. I was okay. Right up until the moment when everything changed again. It was a Thursday evening in October. I was in my workshop, a space I'd set up in my basement over the years for small projects, when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, which was unusual enough to make me a little cautious. "Hello," I answered. "Is this Jeremy Renner?" A woman's voice, professional, slightly urgent. "It is. Who's calling?" "This is Dr. Michelle Hayes from Metropolitan Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter, Victoria Hartwell. She was brought into the emergency room about 2 hours ago with a severe allergic reaction. We've managed to stabilize her, but we're looking for family members, and you're listed as her grandfather." Victoria, my granddaughter, Sarah's daughter, who I hadn't seen in years, who was, as far as I knew, living and working in Manhattan. "I'm here," I said. "I'm her grandfather. Is she okay? What happened?" "We're not entirely sure," Dr. Hayes said. "She apparently ate something she was allergic to, and the reaction was severe. Her roommate called 911. She's stable now, but we'd like to have family here. Can you make it to the hospital?" "Of course," I said. "Which hospital? I'll leave right now." She gave me the address. I grabbed my jacket and my keys, and I drove. The hospital was 40 minutes away, and I drove it in 30, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my mind cycling through a series of possibilities, most of them ending badly. Victoria. I had a granddaughter named Victoria, and I hadn't seen her since she was a teenager. I knew that she'd gone to college, that she'd moved to Manhattan, that she was working at a magazine. But beyond that, she was essentially a stranger to me, someone I was related to by blood but not by knowledge. I found the emergency room and checked in at the front desk. They called someone, and a few minutes later, a nurse came out and led me to Victoria's room. She was conscious, thank God. She was conscious and alert, though her face was swollen from the allergic reaction, and she looked frightened in the way that people look frightened when they've had a brush with their own mortality. "Hi," I said, standing in the doorway. "I'm your grandfather." She looked at me with confusion and something else, something like recognition, but not recognition of me, recognition of the fact that a stranger had just walked into her hospital room claiming familial connection. "My grandfather," she said. "Where's my mother?" "I don't know," I said. "I got a call from the hospital. You were listed as having family, and they called me." "My parents live in Connecticut," she said. "My mother's name is Sarah, Sarah Hartwell." "I know who your mother is," I said, and maybe my tone was sharper than I intended because Victoria flinched a little. "I'm her father. That makes me your grandfather, whether you remember me or not." "I'm sorry," she said. "I remember you, I haven't seen you in so long. I wasn't expecting you to be here." "I know," I said. I pulled a chair over and sat down. "But I am. Tell me what happened. The doctor said you had an allergic reaction." "Yeah," Victoria said. "I went to dinner with some friends, and I thought I was ordering something I'd had before, but it turned out to have nuts in it. I'm severely allergic to nuts. I have an EpiPen, but I didn't have it with me, and by the time my roommate found it and used it, I was already in pretty bad shape." "That must have been terrifying," I said. "It was," she said. "I thought I was dying. I remember thinking, this is how I die, and my mother's going to feel so guilty." I sat with her for a while, and we talked about the accident, about what would happen next, about whether her family knew she was here. "I don't think they do," Victoria said. "I told them to call my mom, but I'm not sure they did. Can you call her?" I was quiet for a moment. I could call Sarah. I could pick up the phone and call the daughter who hadn't spoken to me in nearly 2 years and tell her that her daughter was in the hospital. I could be the one who informed her of a crisis, the one she had to turn to, whether she liked it or not. "I'll call her," I said. I stepped into the hallway and I pulled up my phone. Sarah's number was still in my contacts, though I hadn't called it in so long that I half expected it to be disconnected. I looked at the number for a long moment, and then I pressed dial. She answered on the fourth ring. "Hello." "Sarah, it's Dad," I said. "I'm at Metropolitan Hospital. Victoria's been brought in with a severe allergic reaction. She's stable, but she's been asking for her family." There was a pause. "How did you know about this?" "I was called," I said. "I'm listed as her emergency contact. I'm here and she's safe, but she needs family." "I'll be there," Sarah said, and the line went dead. I went back into Victoria's room and told her that her mother was on the way. Victoria seemed relieved, and we sat together in an awkward kind of companionship, the space between us filled with years of absence. Sarah arrived about 90 minutes later. She came into the room looking like someone who'd dressed in a hurry, her hair pulled back, her clothes wrinkled. When she saw Victoria, her face changed. The efficient woman, the woman who had to manage her grief and anxiety about aging parents, dissolved for a moment, and what was left was a mother who was terrified that she'd almost lost her daughter. She hugged Victoria carefully, avoiding the IV, and she looked at the monitors and the medical charts like she could somehow read in them a guarantee that everything was going to be fine. It was only after she'd spent a few minutes with Victoria, after she'd confirmed with the doctor that her daughter was indeed stable and would be fine, that she seemed to realize I was in the room. She turned and looked at me, and in that moment I saw something move through her. It was too quick to be recognition of who I was, too complex to be a single emotion. It looked like a collision of multiple things: guilt, perhaps an embarrassment, and maybe something that looked like sorrow. "Dad," she said. It was the first time she'd said that word to me in nearly 2 years. Thank you for being here." "Where else would I be?" I said. "I don't know," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she actually didn't know the answer to that question, that she had so successfully erased me from her mental map of the world that it had surprised her to find me in a room with her daughter. We didn't talk much that night. I sat in a waiting area while Sarah stayed with Victoria. A nurse brought me coffee. I read a magazine from about 6 months ago. I waited in the way that families wait during medical emergencies, taking comfort in the fact that I was there, that I was present, even if I was present in a peripheral way. Around midnight, Marcus arrived. He came into the waiting area looking harried and stressed, and he seemed surprised to see me there. "Jeremy," he said, and the fact that he used my name instead of sir, or the old man, or whatever he called me when I wasn't around, suggested that maybe he felt a little guilty about something. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Victoria needed family," I said. "I'll sit with Sarah," he said, as if what he meant was, "I'll take over for you now, you can leave, there's no need for you to be here anymore." I left not long after that. There was nothing else I could do, and I could see that my presence was beginning to feel awkward to Sarah in a new way. Not the way it had felt awkward before, when she'd been worried about me becoming a burden, but awkward in the way that presence can be awkward when something has been broken and hasn't been repaired. I drove home and I didn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen and I thought about the fact that my granddaughter had been listed as having me as her emergency contact, which meant that someone at some point had filled out a form identifying me as family. It meant that I wasn't completely erased. Somewhere, in some database, I still existed in relation to Victoria. Over the next week, I heard through Catherine that Victoria was recovering well, that she was going to be fine. Sarah had taken a week off work to be with her. Marcus was managing the household and their son's schedule. Everything was being handled. I was expecting Sarah to reach out to maybe acknowledge what had happened, the collision of the past and present that had forced us into the same room for the first time in a long time. But she didn't. The silence stretched on. Thanksgiving came and went. Christmas approached, and Sarah remained absent. Then, on a Saturday evening in early December, I got a call from David. "Hey, Dad," he said, "what are you doing this evening?" "Nothing much," I said. "Why?" "I need to talk to you about something," he said. "Can I come over?" He arrived about an hour later, bringing with him the awkward energy of someone who'd been drafted to say something he didn't particularly want to say. "Sit down," I said, and we both sat in my living room in the chairs where we'd had many conversations over the years. "So," David said, "Sarah called me. She wanted to talk to me about some things regarding you." My stomach dropped. I knew what was coming. I could feel it the way you can feel a storm coming, a pressure change in the atmosphere, a particular quality to the light. "What things?" I asked. "She's concerned," David said, "that you becoming involved in the hospital situation with Victoria was, quote, overstepping. She thinks that you used the opportunity to insert yourself back into her life in a way that wasn't appropriate." I stared at David. "I was called by the hospital," I said. "I was listed as her emergency contact. I went to the hospital because her granddaughter was there. How is that overstepping?" "I know," David said. "I told Sarah that. But she's worried that you used it as an opportunity to make her feel guilty or to create some kind of obligation where there isn't one." "Did you tell her that I left before midnight?" I asked. "Did you tell her that I took myself out of the situation the moment Marcus arrived?" "Yeah," David said. "I told her, but I don't think she's really listening. I think she's still locked into whatever narrative she's built about you and your role in her life." "Which is what?" I asked, though I think I already knew the answer. "Which is that you're someone she has to manage," David said. "Someone who represents a problem that needs solving. Even when you're not doing anything except existing in the same room as her, that existence feels like a problem to her." "Then there's nothing I can do," I said. "No," David said, "I don't think there is." We sat in silence for a while. Then David said, "I don't know why I agreed to call you. I didn't want to, but she called me multiple times and she kept saying that I was enabling something, that I was allowing you to have too much access to my family, that I needed to set boundaries." "Did you tell her that you want me in your life?" I asked. "Yes," David said. "I told her that you're my father and that I love you and that you're an integral part of my life. I told her that I made that choice, and she needs to respect it." "What did she say to that?" "She cried," David said. "And then she said that I didn't understand how hard it is for her, that she's trying to do what's best for everyone, and that she feels like she's always caught in the middle between you and your needs, and her need to have a life that isn't defined by obligation." I felt something crack open inside me then. Not anger exactly, but a kind of profound sadness. Because I understood in that moment that Sarah was never going to understand. She was never going to see that her behavior, her choices, her attempts to control and manage my existence were exactly the things that had created this situation. She was never going to understand that she was caught in the middle because she'd made a choice to put herself there, not because the universe had put her there. "Tell her," I said slowly, "that she's not caught in the middle. Tell her that if she's felt caught in the middle, it's because she's been trying to manage a situation that isn't hers to manage. Tell her that I don't need her in my life. I don't need her approval or her acceptance or her love. What I needed years ago was for her to leave me alone to live my own life. And now it's too late for anything else to happen between us." David looked at me with an expression of deep sadness. "Are you sure you want me to say that?" "No," I said, "but I need you to understand that I've stopped waiting for her to change. I've stopped hoping that someday she'll realize what she did was wrong. I've accepted that she probably believes in her own mind that she was acting out of concern for my welfare. I've accepted that she probably thinks she's the victim in this situation. And I've accepted that nothing I do or say is going to change her mind. So tell her, or don't tell her. It doesn't really matter anymore." David left a little while later, looking like he'd been carrying a heavy weight and was grateful, at least, to put it down. I sat alone in my living room, and I thought about the fact that I was 73 years old, and I was still affected by the actions of a 53-year-old woman who wasn't interested in a relationship with me. But less affected, I realized, less invested in the outcome, less desperate for something that was clearly not going to come. The weeks leading up to Christmas were quiet. I worked on some small projects. I had dinner with David and his family once. Catherine called regularly, though she seemed distracted in the way of people who are newly married and consumed with building their new life. Margaret sent a card. Sarah did not reach out. On December 23rd, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Hello," I answered. "Jeremy," a woman's voice, younger, familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. "Yes." "This is Victoria. Victoria Hartwell. You probably don't remember me. We haven't seen each other in a long time, but you were at the hospital when I had my allergic reaction, and I wanted to thank you." "I do remember you," I said. "How are you feeling?" "I'm good," she said. "I'm back at work, back to normal. But I've been thinking about what happened at the hospital, about how you were there, and I wanted to reach out." "I'm glad you did," I said. "I also wanted to apologize," Victoria said, and I could hear in her voice that this was something she'd carefully prepared. "I realized, after the hospital, that you and my mother don't really have a relationship, and that my presence in the hospital might have been awkward for you both. And I'm sorry that I called for family without understanding what that meant." "Victoria," I said, "you don't owe me an apology. You called for family because you were frightened and alone. That's what people do. And I came because that's what people do. You don't need to apologize for any of that." There was a long silence. Then she said, "My mother told me that you've been difficult, that you've refused to make good choices about your future, and that she's been concerned about you for years." I felt something clench in my chest. "Is that what she said?" "It is," Victoria said. "And I believed her for a long time, but I've been thinking about it, and I don't think that's the whole story. I think there's a lot more to it than that, and I think I'd like to hear your side." "I'm not sure there is a side to hear," I said. "I think your mother and I simply have different ideas about what's acceptable in a family relationship." "Will you tell me about it?" Victoria asked. So I did. I told her in broad strokes about the dinners where I'd been told I needed to move into a facility, about the attempts to remove me from my own life, about the way that my family had slowly erased me. I told her about how I'd found purpose through David, about how I'd built a life that worked for me. I told her about the hospital, about how Sarah had reacted to my presence. Victoria listened, and when I was done, she said, "I want you to know that I believe you, and I'm sorry that that happened to you, and I want to stay in touch if you're open to that." "I'd like that," I said. We made a plan to get together for lunch during her winter break, and after we hung up, I sat for a long time, just thinking about the fact that my granddaughter, who I barely knew, had decided to reach out and ask for my version of events, that she had decided to believe me. It was a small thing, but it meant something. Victoria and I had lunch on a Tuesday in early January at a restaurant not far from my house. She was beautiful in the way that all my grandchildren are beautiful, but she had a kind of thoughtfulness to her that suggested she'd experienced enough of the world to know that beauty wasn't the most important thing. We talked about her work at the magazine. She was doing well, she said, though the industry was changing and she wasn't sure how long her job would last. We talked about her apartment in Manhattan, about her roommate, about her friends. We talked about nothing particularly important and everything important all at once. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said as we were finishing our meal. "Of course." "Has my mother ever apologized for anything related to you?" I thought about it. "No," I said, "she hasn't." "Do you think she will?" "No," I said, "I don't think she will. I think in her mind she's already apologized by acknowledging me in the hospital, and that's as far as she's willing to go." Victoria nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "I think I understand," she said. I think I understand what my mother does, at least. I think she's very good at believing her own narrative. And I think she's been telling herself for a long time that she's the victim in this situation, that you've been difficult, that she's been trying to do what's best for you, and that you haven't appreciated her efforts. That's a fair assessment, I said. I don't think it's fair, Victoria said, but I think it's accurate, and I think it's something she might never be able to change. So I want you to know that I see what happened. I see what you did, and I see what my mother did, and I see the difference. We left the restaurant on relatively good terms. Victoria hugged me, and it felt genuine. And as I drove home, I thought about the fact that sometimes you get reconnected with your family in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes it's not the person who gave you life who finds their way back to you. Sometimes it's the person who comes after, someone you barely know, who decides that they want to know you. It took me a long time to write this down. Even now, at 73 years old, with time to spare and nothing but silence in my house, it's difficult to put into words the experience of being slowly erased from your own family. It's difficult to describe the particular horror of watching people you raised, people whose diapers you changed, and whose homework you helped with, look at you like you're a problem that needs solving. What I want you to understand, if you've made it this far, is that this isn't a story with a redemptive ending. This isn't a story where my family suddenly realizes what they've done and comes to me asking for forgiveness. This isn't a story where everything is repaired and we all move forward together, united by love and understanding. This is a story about what happens when people prioritize their own comfort over connection. This is a story about how families fragment, slowly and inexorably, and then pretend that the fragmentation is no one's fault. This is a story about the particular kind of cruel distance that can exist between people who are supposed to love each other. But it's also a story about finding your feet again, about building a life that doesn't depend on someone else's approval. It's a story about the men and women who love you when your family doesn't, about the work that sustains you, about the small moments of connection that make life feel meaningful, even when the people who gave you life don't have room for you in theirs. Sarah is still out there somewhere, living her successful life, managing her nonprofits, hosting dinner parties with people who don't require explanation. I don't know if she thinks about me. I don't know if she feels guilty. I don't know if she's ever told anyone the truth about what happened between us, or if she's continued to tell the story in which I was the difficult one, the one who refused help, the one who wouldn't do what was best for himself. Margaret remains somewhat distant, living her life in Portland, doing therapy work with people who probably have family problems similar to ours. She's respectful and cordial when we interact, but we're not close. I don't fault her for that. Some people are meant to maintain distance from their families of origin. Some people are meant to build lives that are as separate as possible. I think Margaret is that kind of person. Catherine is happy. She's built a good marriage with Robert and she's slowly building the kind of life she always wanted. She calls me regularly. We've repaired what was broken between us, though the repair is visible, like the kind of work I do on old wood. You can see the places where the damage was, but you've made them beautiful in their brokenness. Catherine loves me, I think. Not the way she used to, when she was still trying to be my bridge to the world, but in a more adult, more boundaried way that is perhaps more sustainable. David has been my anchor. David, my quiet middle son, the one I sometimes worried wasn't ambitious enough, has become the person I can trust. We work together regularly. We have real conversations. We know each other not just as father and son, but as men who respect each other's work and each other's choices. If there's redemption in this story, it's in my relationship with David. Victoria has stayed in touch. We have lunch occasionally. She's graduating next spring and she's asked me to attend the ceremony. I said yes. I'd like to see her graduate, to mark this moment in her life, to be present for something that matters to her, even if her mother isn't happy about it, even if Sarah sees my attendance as some kind of intrusion or attempt to manipulate. I'm going because my granddaughter asked me to be there, and that's reason enough. I turned 73 a few months ago. I'm still working, still consulting, still getting called on to solve problems with wood and restoration, and the particular knowledge that comes from doing something for 50 years. I'm still healthy, still relatively strong, still engaged with the world. I have not moved into a senior living community. I have not left my house. I have not accepted the narrative that I became too much to handle. I have built something here in this house, in this life, that is mine. No one gave it to me. No one validated it. I built it for myself, and it's enough. But I want to close with something, if you'll indulge me. If you are the person who's been slowly erased from your own family, if you're the one who's been told over and over that you're too much, that you're a burden, that you're not quite what people need, I want you to know something. I want you to know that you're not what they say you are. I want you to know that their discomfort with your aging, their anxiety about their own mortality, their need to maintain a particular image of themselves as good people, none of that has anything to do with your actual value. I want you to know that I spent years trying to be smaller, quieter, less visible, thinking that if I just made myself smaller, my family would have more room for love. And I was wrong. The smaller I made myself, the smaller my family thought I was. The invisibility was not a result of my size, but a choice that was made by people who wanted me to be invisible. I want you to know that you don't need anyone's permission to take up space. You don't need your family's approval to have a life that matters. You don't need them to recognize your value in order for that value to be real. Build the life you can build. Love the people who love you back. Do the work that matters to you. Make the connections that feel genuine. And let everyone else make their own choices about whether they want to be part of that or not. If you're Sarah reading this, if my oldest daughter found her way to this story and decided to read it, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I'm not sure I'm capable of hating my daughter, even after everything. But I do think you made a choice, and I do think you need to understand what that choice was. It wasn't a choice born of love or concern. It was a choice born of discomfort with the fact that your father was aging, that he wasn't as useful as he used to be, that his existence represented something you didn't want to think about. And I think maybe that's the thing you most need to know, that the discomfort was real and that's okay, but that your response to it, the attempt to control and manage and ultimately erase, was not okay. And that no amount of performance, no amount of appearing to be a good daughter or a concerned family member changes that. 4 plates. That's what I keep thinking about. My name is Jeremy Renner, and I'm 73 years old, and I built a life that works for me even though my family decided they didn't want to be part of it. I have my son who looks at me and sees me. I have my youngest daughter who loves me in a careful, boundaried way that's sustainable. I have my granddaughter who decided to find out who I really am. And I have the work that I do, the way I spend my time, the meaning that I've built for myself. 4 plates. A table with 4 places. Not perfect, not complete, not the family I thought I'd have in my old age, but real. And real is enough. Real is more than I had at 68 when I thought the only option was to disappear. Real is everything. This story is real. It happened exactly as described. I'm sharing it because I needed to. Because somewhere, someone needs to know that they're not alone in this, that families can be broken, that you can rebuild, that life doesn't have to be what other people decided it should be. If you're going through something similar, please reach out. Not to your family if they've shown you they can't handle it, but to someone. Find your David, find your Catherine, find your Victoria, build your 4 plates. You're not alone in this.